Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into a topic that's been generating a lot of buzz lately,
Yeah,
public education in the U.S.
right.
And specifically, the idea that the decline we're seeing in STEM subjects, like science and math,
hmm
might not be so accidental after all.
It's pretty fascinating stuff,
It is. It's actually kind of alarming when you start digging into it.
for sure.
Our guide for this deep dive is a piece by Jaime Hoerricks called The Deliberate Sabotage of Public Education.
Oh, I know this one.
Yeah, have you read this?
I have. It's a pretty provocative take.
It is. They come out strong right from the start, claiming that this decline in quality,
hmm
especially in science and math, is intentional.
Right. Not just like, oh, we messed up or whoops, budget cuts.
Right,
They're
exactly.
saying it's a deliberate choice, like a strategy.
I have to admit, when I first read that, I was like, whoa, hold on, is this a conspiracy theory?
Yeah, I had the same reaction at first.
You know, they even use terms like stupefy the working class. And I thought, "Oof, is that going too far?
It's definitely strong language.
It is, but then the more I read, the more they started laying out their reasoning. And honestly, some of it is pretty thought-provoking.
There's a lot to unpack there, for sure.
There is, and it really gets to the heart of a debate that's been going on forever about the purpose of education.
Totally. Like, what are we even trying to do here?
Right. Is it about like liberating minds, helping everyone reach their full potential, all that good stuff?
Right. The classic ideal.
Exactly. Or, as Hoerricks suggests, is it more about control?
Ooh, interesting.
Maintaining order, making sure the workforce is compliant, not causing too much trouble.
Keeping everyone in line.
Right. It's kind of a cynical view, but
It is.
it makes you think.
It does.
I remember growing up, we were always told that education was the key to the great equalizer.
The American dream.
Right.
Exactly.
Work hard, get good grades, go to college, and you'll be set.
hmm
But Hoerricks makes you wonder if the system's been rigged all along.
And they have this one historical example that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
They talk about the Cold War.
Okay, yeah.
When the U.S. suddenly realized, oh, crap, we need more scientists and engineers if we're going to compete with the Soviets.
Right. We got to beat those Russians to space.
Exactly. And boom, suddenly education funding ramped up.
Like overnight.
Pretty much. And Hoerricks argues that this proves the U.S. knows how to effectively educate its people when it wants to.
Okay, that's a good point.
So their argument is the current underfunding, the neglect we're seeing, it has to be a deliberate choice, driven by different priorities.
So it's not about incompetence. It's not about, oh, we just don't have the money.
Right. They're saying it's a choice.
It's about something else, some other agenda.
Exactly.
So if it's not about a lack of resources, what is driving this decline?
Well, Hoerricks uses this term "incapable," which I had never heard before.
Me neither. What is that?
It's actually a concept from Cory Doctorow.
Okay.
And it basically means that services like public education get worse and worse because the focus shifts
From what to what?
from serving the users, in this case the students, to squeezing out profit.
So it's not just failing. It's being deliberately pushed towards failure.
Right. It's like, how can we make money off of this, even if it means sacrificing quality?
Wow.
And they give some concrete examples.
Oh, like what?
They talk about math curricula, for example, like Kendall Hunt's illustrative mathematics. Apparently, it's so fragmented and confusing, it's almost like it's designed to make kids hate math.
Kidding.
And then they contrast this with what you see in elite private schools.
Oh, right, where the wealthy send their kids.
Exactly. Those schools are basically immune to this whole incapable process.
It's almost like they're two separate systems, right?
It really does seem that way sometimes.
One for the elite and one designed to keep everyone else down.
And that contrast, that gap between the two, is a big part of their argument.
Right. It highlights this idea that the people making decisions about public education often send their own kids to schools that look nothing like the ones they're creating for everyone else.
It's a huge disconnect.
And while we're on the topic of systems that seem designed to hold people back,
Mm-hmm.
Hoerricks also goes after standardized testing.
Oh, yeah, the bane of every student's existence.
Right. They argue that it's less about measuring actual learning and more about controlling students in schools.
It's all about the data, the metrics.
Exactly. And I don't know about you, but those tests always felt more like hoops to jump through than anything else.
I feel you. I remember those days.
What really gets me is the lack of transparency.
That's a big issue.
Like, who decides what's on these tests? How are they scored? What are they actually measuring?
Right. It's all very mysterious.
But they have so much power over students' lives and the fate of entire schools. It's pretty unsettling.
Totally agree. It raises the question, who benefits from all this?
Yeah. because it's definitely not the students or the teachers.
If it's not them, then who is it?
Well, Hoerricks has some pretty strong opinions about that, and they don't shy away from naming names.
Oh,
But before we get into that, they offer some historical context that I found really interesting.
oh, tell me about it.
They compare the U.S. system to what happened in other countries, like the USSR after their revolution.
Okay, that's an interesting comparison.
Right.
What do they say about that?
So they talk about how the Soviets put a huge emphasis on STEM education, right? They launched these massive literacy campaigns.
Everyone's got to learn.
Yeah, and they were actually incredibly successful.
Interesting.
Sputnik, the satellite,
Yeah.
that was a direct result of that focus on science and technology.
Wow.
It makes the U.S.'s investment in STEM during the Cold War seem pretty weak in comparison.
Like, we were playing catch-up.
Yeah, we were scrambling because we felt threatened, but there wasn't a real commitment to improving education for everyone long term.
Not a sustained effort.
No, not really. And Hoerricks points out a similar pattern with China after their revolution.
Okay, another communist country.
Right, another massive push for mass literacy, viewing education as crucial for national development.
So the idea is education can uplift the whole nation.
Yeah, make it stronger.
Interesting.
And they contrast this with the U.S., where private interests have basically been allowed to run wild in the education system.
So are you saying there's a fundamental difference in how some countries view the purpose of education?
That's exactly what Hoerricks is suggesting.
It's about national strengths versus individual gain.
Right, like in countries like the USSR and China, at least at certain points in their history, they saw education as a tool to uplift the entire population.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the U.S., it seems like it's increasingly treated as a path to individual economic gain.
Which, let's be honest, leaves a lot of people behind.
Exactly.
So this brings us back to that question of who benefits from the decline of public education in the U.S.
Right. Who's making money off of this mess?
And this is where Hoerricks gets really specific.
Okay, I'm ready for the dirt.
They start talking about this concept called primitive accumulation, which sounds pretty intense.
Primitive accumulation, what is that? Like stealing from cavemen?
Not quite. It's a Marxist concept.
Okay.
And it basically describes how wealth is extracted from public resources for private gain.
So like taking something that belongs to everyone and turning it into profit for a select few.
Exactly. And they argue that this is what's happening with education in the U.S.
So it's not just about making a profit off of education. It's about taking something that should be a public good, like public schools,
Right.
and turning it into a way for a select few to get richer.
Precisely. And they argue that this ties into a larger strategy of control.
Ooh, how so?
They say a less educated, less critical thinking working class is easier to control and exploit.
So it's about keeping people dumbed down so they don't question the system.
That's the idea, and this connects back to their earlier point about student loan debt.
Oh, yeah, student loans.
They see that as another tool in this system of control.
Wow, I never thought about student loans that way, but it actually makes a lot of sense in this context.
It's about creating a cycle of debt that keeps people trapped.
It's all starting to feel very interconnected. Like, it's not just about education, it's about the whole structure of society.
That's what's so compelling about their analysis. They're connecting these seemingly disparate pieces into a larger picture.
And that's where their Marxist lens really comes into play, right?
Exactly. It provides a framework for understanding how these different systems reinforce each other.
Now, I know not everyone's going to be on board with a Marxist analysis.
Of course, it's a controversial perspective.
But even if you disagree with the ideology,
Mm-hmm.
it does offer a thought-provoking way to understand what's happening.
It helps connect the dots, see the patterns.
So let's dive into some of the specifics of their analysis.
Okay, I'm ready.
They talk about Lenin's idea of monopoly capital, for example, and how it restructures social institutions for profit.
Right, so everything becomes about making money.
Exactly. And they link this to the push for privatizing education that we're seeing today.
Turning schools into businesses.
Right. So instead of education being this public service, it's just another market to be exploited, another way to make money.
Another cog in the capitalist machine.
And then there's Mao's concept of contradiction in education.
Oh, interesting. What's that about?
It's the idea that education has this potential to both liberate and subjugate.
Ooh, a double-edged sword.
Exactly. It can empower people to think for themselves, challenge the status quo, but it can also be used to indoctrinate, to create obedient, unquestioning citizens.
It depends on who's wielding the power.
Right. And Hoerricks argues that the current system is leaning heavily towards the subjugation side.
It's all about compliance, following the rules, not rocking the boat.
Right. Critical thinking and independent thought Not so much.
It's about fitting into the system, not questioning it.
Which makes me think about Gramsci's idea of cultural hegemony.
Oh, yes, the way the dominant class shapes the beliefs and values of society to benefit themselves.
Exactly, and Hoerricks seems to be suggesting that this is happening in education too.
Totally, and they point to the myth of meritocracy as a prime example.
Oh, the idea that success is based solely on individual effort, talent, hard work.
Right, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
But it completely ignores the systemic inequalities baked into the system.
The fact that some people are starting the race miles behind others.
It's a way to make people who are struggling blame themselves rather than the system that's holding them back.
It's a powerful way to maintain the status quo.
It's incredibly effective because it's so subtle. It's not like overt oppression.
It's this invisible hand guiding everything.
And it all ties directly into Hoerricks' call to action.
Ooh, what do they say we should do about all this?
Well, they say we need to reclaim power at the local level.
Okay, interesting.
That's where they shift gears, right? They start talking about the importance of getting involved with local school boards.
It's the ones that actually make the decisions.
Exactly, because that's where a lot of these crucial decisions about education policy are made.
And they point out that the right wing is already doing this, and they're doing it very effectively.
Oh yeah, groups like Moms for Liberty.
Exactly, they're pushing their agendas at the school board level with a lot of success.
It makes you realize that these seemingly mundane local bodies actually have a huge impact
They really do.
on the lives of students and the future of education.
You're the front lines of this battle.
But it also sounds a little intimidating, right?
It can be.
Like, how can one person really make a difference against these organized groups?
Well, Hoerricks argues that understanding power dynamics is crucial here.
Okay, power dynamics.
And they even bring up COINTELPRO.
COINTELPRO.
Yeah, the FBI's program to disrupt and discredit leftist movements.
Oh, wow. That's pretty intense.
It is. It's a chilling reminder of how the state has historically surveilled and suppressed these kinds of movements.
So it's a warning, basically.
Yeah, be aware of the forces you're up against.
Okay, but also be strategic.
Absolutely. Learn from the past, be organized, build strong coalitions.
So it's not just about showing up at a school board meeting and yelling at people.
No, it's about building a movement, creating a shared vision, and developing a long-term strategy.
Right, because we're talking about systemic change.
Exactly. It's not going to happen overnight.
And Hoerricks argues that a crucial part of this is reframing the entire debate around education.
Okay, how do we do that?
They say we need to stop thinking of it as just another commodity
Right. Something to be bought and sold.
and start treating it as a fundamental human right.
That's a powerful shift in perspective.
It is. I love that idea, but it feels like such a massive shift, you know?
It's a huge undertaking.
How do we even begin to change people's minds about something so fundamental?
Well, Hoerricks suggests we start by focusing on the values that underpin a just and equitable education system.
Okay, values like what?
Things like critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, a love of learning for its own sake.
Those are beautiful ideals, but how do we translate those values into concrete actions?
Right, into policies that actually make a difference.
Yeah, how do we make this real?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've laid out Hoerricks' critique. Pretty intense stuff. But now I'm curious, like, what do they actually say we should do? It's easy to get overwhelmed.
That's where I think their focus on local action is really smart. You know,
Yeah.
they're not saying, like, wait for some huge revolution to fix everything.
Right.
It's about starting where you are.
In our own communities.
Exactly.
Right. But I mean, if these are like systemic problems,
Mhm.
entrenched power structures, all that,
I know.
how much can we really change at the local level?
Well, their point is that school boards, like, we often overlook them,
Yeah, sure.
but that's where a ton of decisions about education actually get made.
Budgets, curricula.
Hiring teachers, all of it.
I guess I never thought of school board meetings as like the place to be for political action.
Right.
Hoerricks makes it sound pretty different.
They argue that understanding those local power dynamics, that's key. And they bring up how effective, like, right-wing groups have been at this.
Oh yeah, Moms for Liberty, all that.
Exactly. They've been mobilizing, getting their people elected to these boards.
And shaping policy to fit their worldview.
Exactly.
So in a way, they're kind of showing us how powerful it can be,
They are?
even if we don't agree with their goals.
Mm-hmm. So Hoerricks is saying we need to be doing that too.
Those of us who want a more equitable system.
Show up, make our voices heard, support candidates who get it.
But then there's that part where Hoerricks brings up like COINTELPRO,
Oh, yeah.
the FBI program, disrupting leftist movements.
The dark part of our history.
It is, and it makes you think, like, if we start really pushing back,
Mm-hmm.
are we just going to be targeted?
It's a valid concern, for sure.
It is. So we got to be smart about this.
Sure.
Strategic, organized, build strong coalitions.
Yep. It's not just showing up yelling at a meeting.
Right, it's bigger than that.
The building a movement.
Creating a shared vision, long-term strategy.
Because this is systemic change, it takes time.
Exactly, and Hoerricks talks about reframing the whole debate around education.
Oh, how so?
Stop thinking of it as a commodity.
Something to be bought and sold.
Right, treat it like a human right.
I love that idea.
It's beautiful, but it feels huge, you know.
It is a massive shift.
How do you change people's minds about something that fundamental?
Well, they talk about focusing on the values behind a just system.
Values like what?
Critical thinking, collaboration, creativity,
Right.
loving learning for its own sake.
But how do those translate into action?
Into policies? Yeah, that's the tough part.
How do we make it real in the classroom?
Well, Hoerricks has some specific suggestions,
Okay.
but they also say there's no one size fits all.
Makes sense.
Local communities need to find what works for them.
So it's about empowering communities to take ownership.
Not waiting for the government to fix it.
Right. Building it from the ground up.
Exactly. People who are actually affected by the system, they need to be leading the charge.
Makes sense, but it sounds tough, too.
It is. It's a challenge, for sure.
Where do we even begin?
Well, they suggest starting by building relationships.
Okay.
With teachers, administrators.
The people on the front line.
Exactly. They see the problems every day, often have the best ideas.
It's true. Teachers often get left out of the conversation.
They do, and we need their expertise.
And Hoerricks also talks about engaging with parents, students themselves,
Everyone who's affected.
building a real coalition.
So it's not just the usual people making decisions?
Right. It's more inclusive, democratic.
That's the goal.
And this is where I think their analysis gets really interesting.
Oh, how so?
They connect education reform to, like, broader social movements.
For justice, equality.
Yeah, they're saying you can't have a truly just education system if society itself is unjust.
So it's about changing the world, not just schools.
That's what it sounds like. And that's inspiring.
It is, but daunting, too.
It is. Where do you even start with something that big?
Hoerricks would say, start where you are. With the resources you have, the people around you.
Build those relationships. Have the conversations.
Take small actions. They can ripple outwards.
Find those leverage points.
Exactly, no matter how small.
I like that.
And that's what makes their work so powerful. It's not just criticism.
It's a call to action.
We all have a role to play in this.
I'm curious, though, like, what specific challenges might we hit?
Oh, right. There's going to be pushback.
Yeah, people who benefit from the system as it is.
Exactly. And that's where things get even more complex.
Okay.
That's what we'll look at in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've talked about the problems. We've brainstormed some solutions, but let's be real. Like, change is hard.
It is, yeah.
There's always going to be pushback, right?
Oh, for sure.
People who benefit from things staying the way they are.
They're going to fight to keep their power.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
what does Hoerricks say about, like, how to actually overcome that?
They don't sugarcoat it. I'll
Yeah.
give them that. They spend a lot of time outlining, like, the roadblocks we're likely to hit.
Okay, so give me an example, like, what kind of roadblocks?
Well, one of the biggest is just the power of entrenched interests, right? We talked about corporations making bank off standardized tests, textbooks, privatization.
Right, they're not just going to disappear.
Nope. They have a lot of money, a lot of influence. They're not going to give that up easily.
Yeah, it feels like we're up against a pretty big opponent.
We are, but Hoerricks argues that one of the most effective strategies is building those broad coalitions.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Bringing together all the different groups who care about this.
Teachers, parents.
Students,
Yeah.
community organizations, unions, like everyone.
Strengthen numbers, right?
Exactly, showing that united front.
But even then, like, going up against those with money, political connections.
I know, it can feel impossible.
It does. So what do we do?
Hoerricks talks about being smart about it, you know?
Okay.
Strategic, using our resources wisely, leveraging that collective power.
How specifically?
They talk about legal strategies, litigation, public awareness campaigns, even direct action like boycotts, protests.
So it's about finding those pressure points where we can have the most impact.
Exactly, and hitting them hard.
But Hoerricks also warns against, like, getting so focused on fighting that we forget to build something better.
Right. Right, we need a positive vision, too.
Not just criticizing what's wrong.
But showing what a just system could actually look like.
Okay, so what does that look like? What's their vision?
They talk about things like fostering critical thinking,
We talked about that.
collaboration, creativity, learning for its own sake, not just for a grade.
Right, and addressing those systemic inequalities.
So all students have a chance, regardless of background, zip code.
It sounds like a pretty fundamental shift in how we think about the purpose of education.
It is, they're not just talking about tweaking the system.
It's more like reimagining it completely.
Right, like what if education wasn't just about the workforce?
What if it was about nurturing the whole person?
That's exactly it. That's at the heart of their argument.
Education as a tool for a better society.
More just, more equitable, more democratic.
It's beautiful, but also like a long game, right?
They say that, yeah, it's a struggle that might take generations.
So we got to be in it for the long haul.
Stay committed even when it gets tough, even when progress feels slow.
And remember, it's not just about test scores.
Nope, bigger than that.
It's about a world where everyone has the opportunity to learn, to grow, to contribute.
That's the goal, right.
That's the dream.
And it's a dream worth fighting for.
It really is. I feel more hopeful after reading this, even with all the challenges.
It reminds me that we're not powerless. We can make a difference.
Especially when we work together.
Exactly. Collective action. That's the key.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the deliberate sabotage of public education, what are like the big takeaways?
Well, I hope folks come away with a deeper understanding of the issues.
Right, like how systemic they are, how deep they run.
Connected to all these other parts of society.
And beyond just understanding, I hope people feel empowered.
Yeah.
To actually do something, get involved in their communities.
Advocate for change, however they can.
School board meetings, supporting candidates, even just talking to people about this.
All of it matters.
Because the future of education, it's in our hands.
It is. We have the power to shape it.
And this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive, so
It has.
thanks to Jaime Hoerricks for their work.
And thanks to you for listening.
And remember, the future's in our hands. Let's make it a good one.